Black water. No moon. Only the low groan of a convoy pushing through the North Atlantic. It is winter, 1942. The wind slices across steel decks and freezes spray into glass along the railings. Below the surface, unseen, something moves. A faint line of phosphorescence cuts through the dark. No one on deck sees it. The torpedo strikes just aft of midships. For a split second, there is silence, a strange, hollow thud swallowed by the ocean, and then the night tears open. Steel plates buckle, boilers rupture. A column of fire climbs into the sky as fuel ignites and spills across the waves. Men are thrown against bulkheads. Others scramble toward lifeboats already hanging crooked from shattered davits. The ship begins to list almost immediately, its stern sagging as if the ocean has taken hold of it with both hands. Another explosion, louder this time. In less than 5 minutes, a merchant vessel that took months to build is dying in the dark. Some of the crew will survive. The blast. The water will kill many of them anyway. And somewhere beneath the surface, a German U-boat slips away, already searching for its next target. By early 1942, this was no isolated tragedy. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard, and the Allies were running out of ships. The sinking did not stop at one ship. It did not stop at 10. By the opening months of 1942, merchant vessels were disappearing faster than headlines could print their names. Tankers burned within sight of the American coastline. Cargo ships vanished between Iceland and Liverpool. Convoys were torn apart in storms of torpedoes and flame. Britain depended on the sea for survival: food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts, entire armies. An island nation at war cannot feed itself without ships, and ships were vanishing. In 1941, German submarines had already made the Atlantic deadly. But in early 1942, after the United States formally entered the war, the slaughter intensified. American coastal defenses were unprepared. Merchant captains sailed silhouetted against city lights. U-boat commanders called it their second happy time. For them, it was a harvest. For the Allies, it was arithmetic. Every ship lost meant thousands of tons of cargo erased from existence. Wheat that would not reach Liverpool, aviation fuel that would not power RAF fighters, trucks and tanks that would never reach North Africa. And replacing those ships was not simple. Traditional shipbuilding was slow. It relied on teams of skilled riveters, craftsmen who had spent years mastering their trade. Hull plates were shaped and fastened together by hand, one red-hot rivet at a time. A single cargo ship could take many months to complete. The process was deliberate, almost artisanal. That worked in peacetime. It did not work in a war of attrition. British shipyards were already strained to their limits, bombed by the Luftwaffe, short on materials, short on labor. Every new hull laid down felt like a race against the next convoy report. Across the Atlantic, American industry was enormous, but it was not yet mobilized for total war. Shipyards were expanding, yes, contracts were being signed, but steel cannot be turned into seaworthy hulls overnight. Meanwhile, the tonnage gap widened. More ships were going down than were sliding into the water. The imbalance was not abstract. It showed up in ration books, in fuel shortages, in the nervous calculations of Allied planners who understood a brutal truth. Without cargo ships, there would be no buildup of troops in Britain. Without that buildup, there would be no invasion of Europe. Without supplies crossing the Atlantic, the war could not be won, no matter how many tanks or aircraft rolled off American assembly lines. Germany did not need to conquer London, it only needed to sink enough steel. By the spring of 1942, some officials quietly feared the same outcome that had nearly strangled Britain in the First World War. A nation starved not by invasion, but by absence. The Atlantic was no longer just a battleground. It was a scale, and the numbers were tipping in the wrong direction. Desperation does something to pride. By mid-1942, British officials were no longer asking for beautiful ships. They were asking for ships that floated. Across the Atlantic, American planners reached a blunt conclusion. If traditional shipbuilding could not keep up with submarine warfare, then shipbuilding itself would have to change. Not refined, not improved, reinvented. The answer they proposed did not inspire confidence. The design was plain. Box-shaped, straight lines, no elegance in the bow, no graceful curves in the stern. It would be slow, barely 11 knots. It would not outrun a submarine. It would not win races or turn heads in port. It was built for one purpose only, to carry cargo across an ocean at war. Naval architects scoffed, merchant captains grumbled, some British. Observers privately questioned whether such a vessel would even survive Atlantic storms. It looked less like a product of maritime tradition and more like something assembled from industrial blueprints, which, in truth, it was. The ship would measure roughly 440 feet in length. It would displace around 14,000 tons when loaded. Its triple expansion steam engine was not cutting-edge technology. It was old, reliable, proven. Nothing about it was revolutionary, except how it would be built. The philosophy behind the design was radical. Simplify everything. Strip away complexity, make every hull identical, make every part replaceable. Design it so it could be constructed not by master craftsmen, but by workers trained in weeks. It would not be a ship for peacetime, it would be a ship for survival. Some called it crude, others called it temporary, a stopgap solution until real ships could be built again. But the men studying the tonnage charts understood something different. The Atlantic did not need masterpieces. It needed numbers. If one ship could not be protected from torpedoes, then perhaps the answer was not better armor or faster engines. Perhaps the answer was simply this: build so many that sinking them no longer mattered. The so-called ugly duckling was about to enter the water, and with it, a new kind of warfare. For generations, ships had been built the same way. Steel plates were held together by rivets, thousands upon thousands of them. Teams of skilled workers heated each rivet until it glowed, hammered it into place, sealed the seams by hand. The process was loud, labor-intensive, and slow. It demanded experience, it demanded precision, and it demanded time the Allies no longer had. The new cargo ships would not be riveted together, they would be welded. It sounds like a small technical adjustment. It was not. Welding meant steel plates could be fused directly, edge to edge, without overlapping seams. Entire sections of hull could be assembled in advance, flat on the ground, and then lifted by crane into place. Instead of constructing a ship piece by piece along a slipway, workers could build it in blocks like industrial components on a factory floor. This was not traditional shipbuilding. This was manufacturing. Welding required far less specialized training than riveting. A worker could be taught the basics in weeks instead of years, and that changed everything. Because America did not have an unlimited supply of master shipwrights, but it did have something else. It had people, farmers who had never seen the ocean, office clerks, high school graduates, men too old for frontline service, and, increasingly, women stepping into heavy industry for the first time. In shipyards stretching from California to Maine, sparks began to fly day and night. Arc torches hissed, steel glowed white under the flare of welding arcs. Hull sections took shape not in quiet craftsmanship, but in roaring 24-hour shifts. The transformation was immediate. Shipyards were reorganized along assembly line principles. Instead of one crew building a ship from keel to mast, multiple teams worked simultaneously on prefabricated sections, bows, sterns, engine rooms, each moving steadily toward final assembly. It was a gamble. Welded hulls had rarely been tested at this scale. Some engineers worried about structural weaknesses, about how long seams would hold under Atlantic storms. There were concerns about brittleness in cold water, about fractures spreading along welded joints. But the alternative was worse. Continue building slowly, and watch the Atlantic swallow everything. So the gamble was made. Speed would replace tradition, volume would replace elegance. And for the first time, the ocean war would be answered not by bigger guns, but by brighter sparks in American shipyards. Welding made the ships faster to assemble. Standardization made them unstoppable. The new cargo vessel would not exist as a unique creation each time it touched water. It would be identical, down to the bolts, the hatches, the engines deep within its hull. Every Liberty ship would carry the same layout, the same boiler system, the same triple expansion steam engine design, the same cargo configuration. It was a deliberate choice. In peacetime, shipbuilders prided themselves on refinement, small improvements, custom fittings, incremental innovations, but refinement slows production. Customization complicates repair. Variation invites delay. War demanded the opposite. If a ship limped into port with a damaged engine, the solution could not depend on specialized parts manufactured months apart. Replacement components had to fit instantly, without redesign. A crew in Liverpool or Halifax needed to know that the ship before them was constructed exactly like the one they repaired last week. Interchangeability became doctrine. Steel. Plates were cut to uniform dimensions. Prefabricated sections followed the same blueprint regardless of which yard produced them. Inland factories assembled boilers and engines that would later be shipped to coastal yards for installation. The result was something new in naval history. Ships built not as individual vessels, but as products. They rolled down the ways in predictable rhythm. Workers did not need to reinvent the process each time. They repeated it, improved it, timed it. But this was still a gamble. Uniformity leaves little room for error. If a flaw exists in the design, it multiplies. Early Liberty ships experienced cracks in their welded hulls, especially in the frigid North Atlantic. Steel could turn brittle in extreme cold. Fractures sometimes spread farther than expected. Critics seized on these failures. They called the ships dangerous, cheap, disposable in the worst sense. Yet even as engineers reinforced weak points and adjusted steel compositions, the EU's production lines did not slow, because the arithmetic was clear. If each ship was simple, and each part replaceable, and each hull identical, then production could accelerate beyond anything the Atlantic had ever seen. The gamble was no longer about whether one ship would survive. It was about whether thousands could be built before the ocean swallowed the war itself. By late 1942, the shipyards were no longer experimenting. They were accelerating. At the Kaiser Yard in Richmond, California, crews worked under floodlights that turned night into a permanent dawn. Prefabricated hull sections arrived like components of a massive steel puzzle. Cranes swung into motion with mechanical rhythm. Welding torches sparked in synchronized bursts along the spine of a forming vessel. And then came the demonstration, the SS Robert E. Peary. The goal was not subtle. It was spectacle, proof that the system worked. Workers prepared in advance. Materials were staged with military precision. Crews rehearsed their sequences like a choreographed drill. On November 8, 1942, construction began. Steel plates were set, bulkheads raised, decks laid in rapid succession. Thousands of workers moved in disciplined coordination, each assigned a narrow, repeatable task. There was no pause to admire progress, no hesitation. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the ship slid into the water. The achievement made headlines. Photographs captured smiling workers beneath banners celebrating the record. Reporters called it miraculous. But the miracle was misunderstood. The record itself did not win the war. A single ship built in 4 days changes nothing. What mattered was the system behind it, the supply chains, the standardized parts, the prefabrication, the welding crews who could repeat the process again and again. The Robert E. Peary was proof of concept. From that moment forward, Liberty ships began entering the Atlantic not as isolated hulls, but as a steady procession. One launched today, another tomorrow, another the day after. Shipyards along the American coastline became conveyor belts of steel moving toward war. And while U-boats still hunted in the darkness, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since the Atlantic campaign began, the Allies were no longer simply reacting. They were producing. While American shipyards roared to life, the Atlantic remained deadly. In early 1942, German submarine commanders believed victory was within reach. They called it the Second Happy Time. After the United States entered the war, coastal defenses along the eastern seaboard were thin. Cities from New York to Miami kept their lights burning at night. Merchant vessels sailed in clear silhouette against glowing shorelines, perfect targets against the horizon. U-boats slipped through these waters almost unchallenged. Tankers exploded within sight of beaches. Oil washed ashore in black tides. Survivors drifted in lifeboats not far from American cities that were only beginning to understand the scale of the danger offshore. For the submarine crews, it felt like 1940 all over again, the early days of unrestricted success against Britain. Tonnage reports climbed, sinkings were confirmed by radio. The math seemed to favor the hunter. Each torpedo cost a fraction of the steel it destroyed. Each cargo ship sent to the bottom meant thousands of tons erased. Food, fuel, machinery, ammunition. The Atlantic supply line still appeared fragile, stretched thin across thousands of miles of open ocean. From a periscope's narrow field of view, the war looked winnable. A convoy approached, a torpedo fired, another freighter broken apart in flame, but something unseen was beginning to change beyond the horizon. For every ship sunk, another hull was taking shape in an American yard. For every tanker lost, another was sliding down a slipway into gray water. The submarine. Commanders did not yet feel it. At sea, success still came in flashes of fire, but beneath the surface of the war, beyond torpedo wakes and burning decks, the numbers were shifting. And the ocean does not care about individual victories. It responds only to volume. By mid-1943, the war in the Atlantic began to change in a way that could not be seen through a periscope. There was no single decisive battle, no dramatic announcement, no moment when a fleet surrendered. Instead, there were numbers. At first, the losses still looked catastrophic. Convoys were attacked, ships still burned, sailors still died in freezing water. U-boat captains continued to send proud reports back to headquarters. But now, every sinking entered a larger equation. For every freighter sent to the bottom, 2 more were launching from American yards, then 3, then more. Shipyards that had once struggled to complete a handful of vessels per month were now producing them by the dozens. East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, hulls slid into the water with mechanical regularity. Crews were trained, assigned, dispatched. Cargo holds filled almost as soon as they were completed. The Atlantic did not grow quieter. It grew crowded. Convoys lengthened, escort screens thickened, destroyers and corvettes multiplied alongside the merchant ships they guarded. Air patrols stretched farther from shore as long-range aircraft joined the fight. The space in which submarines could operate freely began to shrink. German commanders started noticing something unsettling. There were still targets, but there were more of them than ever before. Sinkings no longer produced the same strategic effect. A tanker destroyed off Newfoundland did not create a fuel crisis. A freighter lost west of Ireland did not halt the buildup of troops in Britain. Supplies continued to flow: wheat, aviation fuel, artillery shells, trucks, spare parts. The arithmetic had shifted. Submarines were still capable of killing ships, but they could no longer kill faster than ships were being born. And war, at its core, is endurance. A torpedo is a weapon of precision. Mass production is a weapon of persistence. One strikes in seconds, the other works without pause. By the time many U-boat crews sensed the tide turning, it was already too late. Losses among submarines began to climb. Improved sonar, better coordination, constant air cover, all of it combined with the most unforgiving factor of all. There were simply too many ships to sink. The Atlantic was no longer a fragile lifeline stretched thin across hostile water. It was becoming a conveyor belt, and the belt was moving faster every month. By late 1943, the Atlantic was no longer defined by isolation. It was defined by movement. Liberty ships crossed in steady columns, gray hull after gray hull stretching from horizon to horizon. Their decks were stacked with crates, trucks lashed in rows, barrels of fuel secured. Against the swell. Deep in their holds were the raw materials of victory: steel beams, artillery shells, locomotives in pieces, entire prefabricated bridges. They were not glamorous vessels. They rolled heavily in rough seas. They creaked under strain. Their engines throbbed with an old rhythmic pulse that spoke more of reliability than speed. But they kept coming. From New York and Baltimore, from New Orleans and Houston, from San Francisco and Portland, American industry was no longer feeding only its own armies. It was feeding a continent. In Britain, docks that once stood half empty now filled with arriving cargo. Cranes swung into motion, rail cars waited along the quays, tanks rolled off ramps, aircraft engines were unloaded and rushed inland, food stocks stabilized, fuel depots expanded. The buildup was visible. Warehouses swelled, airfields multiplied, camps spread across the English countryside as divisions arrived in waves. Each of those soldiers carried equipment that had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a cargo ship. Without those ships, there would be no assembly of force, no sustained campaign in North Africa, no reinforcement of the Soviet Union through Arctic convoys, no massive concentration of men and machines in Britain. The Liberty ships were not warships. They carried no heavy guns. They rarely made headlines. But they were doing something far more decisive. They were turning the Atlantic from a barrier into a bridge. Every safe arrival narrowed the window of opportunity for Germany. Every completed voyage strengthened the inevitability of an Allied return to Europe. The submarine could still strike, but the flow no longer stopped. The conveyor belt of steel moved relentlessly eastward, toward a continent that would soon feel the full weight of what those ships had delivered. In the end, the Atlantic campaign did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It was buried under output. By 1943, American shipyards were launching Liberty ships at a pace the world had never seen. Some yards averaged 3 ships every 2 days. Across the nation, hull after hull entered the water with almost industrial indifference, no longer celebrated as miracles, but expected as routine. The numbers became staggering. Hundreds completed in a year. Then more. Eventually, more than 2,700 Liberty ships would be built. The German submarine force had prepared for a war of attrition. What it encountered instead was a war of multiplication. Each U-boat carried a finite number of torpedoes. Each patrol lasted only so long before fuel and provisions ran low. Each crew faced exhaustion, mechanical strain, and the tightening net of Allied air and naval patrols. But American industry did not tire. Factories did not need to surface to recharge batteries. Shipyards did not return to port to resupply. They worked in shifts, morning, afternoon, night, a continuous hum of welding arcs and clanging steel. The submarine was a hunter. The Liberty ship was a statistic, and statistics are merciless. By mid-1943, Allied shipping losses began to fall sharply while construction continued climbing. U-boat losses surged. Improved sonar, better convoy tactics, long-range bombers, and escort carriers all played their role. But beneath those tactical improvements was something more fundamental. The submarine was being asked to defeat an industrial system larger than itself. It could destroy ships. It could not destroy capacity. And once that became clear, the outcome of the Atlantic War was no longer in doubt. There comes a moment in every war when a front stops moving backward, not because the fighting ends, but because the foundation beneath it hardens. By late 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a fragile artery threatened with collapse. Convoys sailed in disciplined formations, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that could now patrol far beyond the coastline. Radar improved, sonar sharpened, escort carriers filled the air gap that had once been a sanctuary for submarines. But the true transformation was quieter. Ships were arriving, consistently, predictably, in volume. Harbors in Britain that had once waited anxiously for depleted convoys now processed a steady stream of cargo. Fuel depots filled to capacity. Ammunition stockpiles expanded. New divisions disembarked with full equipment. Heavy machinery rolled onto docks in numbers that no longer suggested desperation, but preparation. The ocean that had nearly strangled Britain was now sustaining it. The change was not symbolic. It was logistical. Planning staffs began thinking months ahead instead of days. Operations once considered impossible due to supply risk were now calculated with confidence. The buildup for a cross-channel invasion, something unthinkable during the darkest days of 1942, moved from theory to timetable. The Atlantic had ceased to be a gamble. It had become a guarantee. Submarines still prowled. Some still found their mark. But each sinking no longer threatened collapse. It was absorbed, replaced, diluted within the immense flow of steel and cargo. Where there had once been isolation, there was now connection. Where there had once been fear of interruption, there was continuity. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was a bridge, and across that bridge moved the weight of an entire industrial civilization, steadily, relentlessly, toward Europe. Today, only a handful remain. Along quiet rivers and in sheltered harbors, a few Liberty ships still float, their steel weathered, their paint long faded beneath layers of salt and time. Their lines are still boxy, still practical, still unmistakable. They were never meant to last. They were designed as emergency vessels, temporary solutions for an emergency war, built quickly, built simply, built to carry and keep moving, and yet some endured. Stand on the deck of one of these surviving ships, and the scale becomes personal. The holds that once swallowed thousands of tons of cargo now sit empty and echoing. The engine room, once vibrating with heat and pressure, is silent. The steel plates still bear the marks of hurried welds, seams fused under floodlights by workers who may never have seen the ocean before that day. They were called ugly ducklings, too plain, too slow, too crude for the traditions of the sea. But they crossed the Atlantic in storms and under fire. They carried the fuel that powered bombers, the food that fed cities, the trucks that moved armies. They made possible the concentration of force that would one day land on the beaches of Normandy. These ships were never heroes in the romantic sense. They had no guns blazing in broadside duels, no dramatic last stands. Their strength was repetition, trip after trip, convoy after convoy, steel replacing steel. The survivors are quiet now, but they are monuments to something far greater than a single voyage. They are reminders that victory sometimes rests not on brilliance, but on endurance. When the war ended, the headlines celebrated generals, battles, and breakthroughs. Few mentioned cargo ships. Yet without them, none of those victories would have been possible. The Liberty ship was never the fastest vessel afloat. It was not heavily armed. It did not intimidate enemies by appearance alone. It was designed with one priority above all others: speed of construction. That choice changed the course of the Atlantic War. Germany entered the conflict believing it could sever supply lines faster than the Allies could restore them. Submarines were meant to strangle an empire, to turn the ocean into a weapon. Instead, the ocean became a test of endurance, and endurance favored industry. The Liberty ships proved a harsh truth about modern war. Tactical brilliance cannot overcome sustained industrial superiority. A torpedo can sink steel. It cannot sink production capacity. It cannot sink a system that replaces losses faster than they occur. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war. They carried millions of tons of cargo. They enabled the buildup in Britain. They sustained campaigns across multiple continents. They turned logistics into destiny. Their legacy extends far beyond 1945. The principles behind them, standardization, modular construction, interchangeable parts, mass output, shaped post-war shipbuilding and global trade. The modern container ship, the vast networks of international supply chains, the quiet assumption that goods will arrive on time across oceans, all echo lessons first proven under wartime pressure. The Liberty ship demonstrated something enduring. Wars are not decided by weapons alone. They are decided by the ability to build, to replace, to sustain. 6. In the darkest months of 1942, the Atlantic was a graveyard. By 1944, it was a highway. And that transformation was forged not by a single battle, but by thousands of welded seams burning day and night along the edges of a continent determined to outbuild the storm.